So first of all, thank you for being here tonight. It's been a wild week for a lot of people, and it's great to have folks who are showing up this evening to join us for this event. And this is great. I've been really looking forward to this event. We are featuring tonight Robbie Arnott in conversation with Kawai Strong Washburn. They'll be discussing Robbie's new novel, The Rain Heron. I'll be hosting. My name is Alex. I'm the events director at Brookline Booksmith in Brookline, Massachusetts. You may be familiar with our store. If so, welcome back. If this is the first time that you are visiting us or hearing about us, welcome. It's really lovely to have you be part of our community tonight. We're an independent bookstore that's been where we are for now 60 years, and we appreciate your support of our indie and to incredible authors through your purchases, through your attendance, through being here tonight. As I said, the chat and question boxes are open, so feel free to make use of those. Remember, if you would like to speak to other attendees, to set your chat to all panelists and attendees so you can talk to each other. And please drop any of your questions for Robbie into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. That's the best way to get them to us. Make sure they're not lost in the chat. Please note that Brookline Booksmith has a strict policy against abusive behavior and language, and at our discretion, any attendee can be removed from an event for partaking in such behavior. Tonight, it's a privilege to welcome two skilled emerging novelists into our event series. Kawai Strong Washburn, this evening's moderator, is the author of an incredible first novel, Sharks in the Time of Saviors, which, like The Rain Heron, is a book that embraces the interwoven strands of our planet's biography, human tragedy and ecstasy, and living mythologies. He was born and raised in the Hamakua coast of the Big Island of Hawaii. His work has appeared in Best American Non-Required Reading, McSweeney's, and Electric Literature's Recommended Reading, among other outlets. He was a 2015 Tin House Summer Scholar and a 2015 Bread Loaf Work Study Scholar. I'm very, very happy to have him here tonight. His work is stunning and fresh, and I can't wait for there to be more of it. Thank you, Kawai, for being here. It's a delight to introduce our featured author this evening. Robbie Arnott lives in Tasmania. So first of all, thank you so much for calling us from the morning. He is the author of the novel Flames, which won the Margaret Scott Prize, was shortlisted for the Victorian Premier's Literary Prize for Fiction, the Guardian's Not the Booker Prize, and the Readings Prize for New Australian Fiction, which I realize may be Readings, so I'm sorry about that, and was longlisted for the Miles Franklin Literary Award. In 2019, he was named the Sydney Morning Herald Best Young Australian Novelist. The Rain Heron, his new novel, takes place after political and environmental calamity and brings together two women who should be bitterly opposed, a farmer and a soldier. Between them lies the soldier's urgent search for a mythical creature called a rain heron, said to be able to shape the weather. In an era where instability is not only present fact but future certainty, our literature has more and more broadly sought to envision the life that persists when calamity arrives to meet us. The Rain Heron is a troubling, immersive, beautifully executed fable that leaves room for camaraderie and love in brutal times. I'm happy to turn the stage over now to the authors. Please welcome Robbie Arnott and Kawai Strong Washburn.
Thank you very much, Alex. It's wonderful to be here.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was such a lovely intro. I really appreciate that, and thank you to everyone in the audience that has shown up tonight. I know, depending on where you are in the country right now, you might be dealing with a little bit of insanity around some of the strong winter storms that have rolled through. So if you found a space to join us, even in the midst of strange weather, we really appreciate it. So I guess I'll start things off. That was, I thought, an excellent synopsis of the book, and I have a bunch of different questions that I'd love to get some insight on, Robbie. But just to start off, something that's really interesting to me is hearing what it is that makes writers sort of become writers. Have you always felt like somebody that has wanted to write? Is it something that you've come into relatively recently? Tell us a little bit about how you became a writer.
Yeah, thanks, Kawai. And yeah, again, thanks, Alex, for that lovely intro and that lovely bit about the book. I'm quite honoured. Yeah, I guess I never consciously became a writer, I don't think. I was really lucky. I was born and raised here in Tasmania, which is basically North Antarctica. And I was just surrounded in a house of books all the time by my family. And every sort of if I ever wanted anything as a child, I had to progress to a different reading level. My parents were kind of weird like that. So I just really liked reading, and I was obsessed with it as a kid. And when I became a teenager and a young adult, trying to make up my own stories and write things just seemed like a natural extension of that. So I didn't ever have that penny drop moment where I thought I want to be a novelist. I just wrote very, very poorly for about 10 years until I started getting stuff that was perhaps publishable. And no one ever told me not to do it. So I was just doing it all the time anyway. Yeah, I don't know what yours is like, Kawai, if you had any particular moment where you became a writer, but mine felt like it was just always there, and eventually it started gaining traction.
Yeah, no, I think for me, I don't think there was ever a moment where I thought I'm going to be a writer. I think there are some people who at some level it's a calling, or it's something that they make their mind up really early, that it's the major defining characteristic of their identity or things like that. But for me, I certainly wrote a lot when I was younger, and I feel like there were some teachers I had in elementary school that were complimentary of my writing, but I don't think it meant anything to me at that time. And I never thought, oh, I'm good. As my whole life is going to revolve around writing. I think it just became something that I was doing through artistic expression. And I finally got to a place where I wanted to try and get writing published. And that was when I started sort of focusing on the craft side of it and things like that. But before that, I think I had mostly stuck to just sort of writing things that I needed to for class. Like if I had a creative writing class where I had to write a story, I would write a story for the class, but I hadn't really ever thought of doing it on my own as a form of artistic expression. And tell me just a little bit more about Tasmania. I love that you said it's basically North Antarctica. I've never been, so there's so much that I don't understand about Tasmania. How much of that is in the novel in terms of the physical environment? Because the place is unnamed. The places in which things are happening are unnamed, and so I'm not sure if the physical environment that's described in the Rain Heron reflects some part of Tasmania, if it's something wholly different, if it was inspired by some subset of the landscape there.
Yeah, I mean, Tasmania is an island off the south of the Australian mainland, if anyone's unaware. It's separated 3,000 years ago. And it's very different from your stereotypical ideas of Australia. There's no deserts, there's no big red kangaroos. It's probably more similar in climate to, say, Seattle or something like that. Quite a lot of rain. It can be a bit cold, but the summers are nice. And we have these amazing mountains and forests, and it's well known these days for its incredible environment and landscape, hiking and beaches and things like that. It's a very naturally beautiful place. So in the novel, I wanted to set it in a country that was unnamed because I didn't want the story to be too anchored to a specific place, because I thought that would then imbue the narrative and imbue the tale with all the loaded meanings that specific real places have. But at the same time, I'm a bushwalker and I'm from Tasmania. So all these Tasmanian elements found their way into the book. So there's lots of things in there that are actually quite distinctively Tasmanian. For example, there's a section of the book set on a coastline where there's these big domed pink grey boulders, almost mountainous boulders behind the coast. That looks a lot like Tasmania's east coast. We have these kind of huge granite coastline, which is really quite unique, and it's really, really beautiful. And I didn't realize I was doing that till I finished the section and went, oh, that's very similar to Tasmania's east coast. But these things, I think, come out of you when you're creating stories, whether you mean them to or not.
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny how things slip in that, for me as a writer, I try to consciously eschew any aspects of my own autobiography or experiences I've had in my life or things like that. I try to avoid putting any of myself into my creative writing, so that there's room to, I feel like there's more creative freedom for me to kind of avoid those things. But it's funny, things still sneak in. Later on, I'll look over things and be like, well, I really try to avoid myself, but there I am. You still find your way into the writing. Is there any, so there's certainly a lot of things that are off the page and make it's the time and the sort of political reality that the story takes place in. Those things are all it's hard to pin those down a little bit. And I wonder, as you're writing this out, were there elements of the world that this novel takes place in? And by world, I just mean the place of the novel and sort of its main concerns. Were there parts of it that you had initially built out and then decided to leave out? Or, so for instance, I guess what I'm thinking about is, it seems like there's some sort of significant political conflict that has taken place and is taking place during the novel. And yet it's never really directly named or described or anything like that. And had you spent a bunch of time in your head thinking about like, oh, here's what actually was happening, and there's like a coup that was happening at the seat of the government, and there were these armed conflicts, and you wrote all of that or thought about all of that and then left it off the page? Or did you just sort of piece together bits of what you thought might be a conflict as you were writing?
You're totally spot on. You've caught me. Yeah, there definitely was. But I guess when I started the book, I wanted to create a fable or a myth about a creature that has this kind of intrinsic relationship and power over nature, and then have characters interacting with it, because I thought it'd be interesting to have different characters being forced to confront something that shouldn't exist, and then how their lives would pan out after that. And as I was writing it, it made sense to me to set it in a landscape or a place that was quite muted and numbed by something. And I settled on the idea of it being after a military coup in the unnamed country. That made sense to me, that people would be a little bit reticent, a little bit kind of introverted in their behavior because of the horrors that have come before through a coup. And so as I started doing that, I got a bit excited. I came up with this whole idea of the coup and why it happened and who the players were and what sort of violence went past. And as I was through the writing of the book, I started to realize that none of that was actually important to the story. It was exciting and interesting for me to come up with it. But when I went back on it, first of all, I didn't think the quality of the writing was very good in those sections compared to the bits that were dealing with the rain heron and the natural environments. So that put me off it. But also I just realized I was padding and over-explaining the kind of the background of the book. And then I realized I don't really like books that over-explain themselves. I like to leave a bit of it to my own imagination. So I thought I should probably have my book like that as well, and lean into the things I enjoy, because I can cross my fingers and hope other readers will enjoy that too. So you're totally right. I did have these kind of ideas that explain all the military conflicts and everything, but I just left 95% of them out in the end.
Yeah. And hopefully for the audience and for everybody else that's part of this event, hopefully you can't hear my children in the background, but if you can, it's that time of night. So for anybody that has children, and if the witching hour for your children is right around dinner time or 5 to 6 in the evening, that's what I'm going through right now. So there was a bunch of noise a minute ago. Hopefully, I think I muted through it. But so, I want to continue on a little bit now that we're talking about sort of what happened off the page, or sort of the early portions of this novel. What ended up being, I have a bunch of questions about the novel itself, but now that we're talking just a little bit about craft, I was also curious, what was the biggest challenge for you while you were working on this?
To be honest, the biggest challenge was writing the scenes that are quite violent, and then continuing the story of those characters who've enacted that violence, because that's a lot of what this book does. Is it deals with how the violence we inflict on each other kind of bleeds over into the violence we inflict on the natural world. And we were attempting to have characters do these horrible things or experience these quite violent things, and then leave them alone and move away from that. But I realized if I was going to do this story properly, I needed to continue along with those characters who at the time are quite detestable. So I found that, quite mentally stretching, because I didn't like them any more than a reader would like them while I was doing it. But I felt like I had a duty to tell their story properly. And I'm not a violent person at all. I don't like violence. And so it was, that was tough. But I just felt I had to. Also, there's quite a lot of pus in the book. And,
There it is.
and that wasn't much fun either. So, my editor, when I sent it to him here in Australia, I must have removed one scene, and he said, he was really happy there was one less scene involving infection. So that was good. The rest of it's not like that, but yeah.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of sepsis and wounds and things that sort of, they just simmer and become even more painful after they've been inflicted. And it was, there are parts of that that are very uncomfortable to deal with, but I think there's something to be said for, I didn't get the sense those things were in there gratuitously, right? And so there are these moments of violence, or there are these wounds that don't heal and they fester. And while there was a sense of discomfort in reading through those things, I didn't get the sense that as a writer, that you were enjoying those scenes, or that there was some sort of underlying sort of creepiness in terms of the descriptions, or that they were gratuitous just for the sake of reveling in violence or things like that. And speaking about one of the perpetrators of the violence in particular, and is her name, is it Zoe or Zoe? I don't know which of those it is.
Zoe, I guess. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't know, because I know a lot of times put the 2 dots over the E. Anyway, Zoe as a character is one of the characters that inflicts a certain amount of violence and also experiences some level of that herself. She seems like one of the characters that becomes, if there is a protagonist, it kind of settles on her. We follow her through several different stages, and we sort of see the arc of her life in a lot longer period than we do for some of the other characters. And I wonder, I had read an interview that you had given, I can't remember which outlet it was with, where you had mentioned that you didn't know the gender of the characters until a little bit farther along. How much of the characters did you sort of find out over the course of the story, and how much of it was there up front? In particular, I'm curious about that with Zoe, because she seems like a character that is she's so complete on the page in terms of our experience of her. We get to see so many parts of her life. We see her childhood, we see her when she's older, we see these moments of violence and the aftermath of that violence, and how she sort of reconciles parts of herself in the later stages of the story. And so I wonder how much of that was organically a result of the story, and how much of it was decided up front, because it sounds like you didn't even know necessarily what her gender would be until some portion of the writing had happened.
Yeah, it was mostly organic. I did settle on her being a woman quite quickly, but initially I wasn't too sure. It was more when I was trying to figure out what her character motives were and what she was going to do, that it quickly made sense to me that she was a woman, not a man, because her as a man, or her character as a male character, I just found boring and kind of predictable. And so the same thing with the character of Ren. I thought that was if she was a male character, she'd be a bit more of a cliche and less interesting, and just not very original. But as for the story of Zoe and the story of the other characters they go through, it was really quite an organic process. I didn't have a map laid out. I didn't have sticky notes all over my wall. I didn't have the plot too firmly planned out. I just kind of had a few moments in my mind that I was writing towards. And I guess I find with my writing, that's the most fruitful way I can do it. Because I often find the things I put down as diversions or as little ideas that I assume won't really come into the plot at all, are the things that end up being really important and I can't let go of. And I can't predict that at all. I don't know when those things will come or when they'll happen. I just end up coming back to them saying, oh, that little flight of fancy I had the other day actually is probably going to be a key plot point and a key function of that character's personality. So that's particularly true with Zoe, particularly true with her experiences through the book. I don't want to give too much away, but the experiences of her childhood, I didn't have that all set out or planned out that well. It was really feeling my way through it, which is why I feel really bad when I meet any younger or emerging writers who ask me for tips on how to do it. And I say, I have no idea. I just have to figure it out through blood, sweat and tears. But yeah, very much an organic process.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that sometimes when people ask me about that and they're sort of curious about what the writing process is, I find that it's different for me for every given thing I'm working on. Sometimes there's more of it that I come to the page with sort of more of an idea of, I don't know, what it is I'm interested in or what the questions are that I'm asking, or I have some images of a few different characters and some interaction they have, and I can kind of start from there. And other times I don't really know what I'm going to be writing about too much, and I just start writing and it becomes a very organic process. And so I find that every piece of writing has its own seed, and that seed sort of dictates the way the process goes from there. And sometimes if I have more ideas up front or more things that I kind of have floating around, I might sit down and do a little bit of high level planning with those things before I start writing. So it really just varies from from project to project. But it's interesting. What for me, and this is, I would love to hear, what your thoughts are as well. But for me, I think some of those discoveries and surprises that happen are part of what that's part of the pleasure of writing. Sometimes people ask me like, why do you write, or things like that. And I think there's a million different answers you can give, but I think one of the things is that, well, because I like it, because I enjoy it. And the parts of it that I enjoy are those sorts of moments where there's this serendipity of you're working on a story or you have some interesting thoughts and something just happens. That day you're sitting there writing, you're thinking about something or trying to make something happen in the story, and you surprise yourself with something that there was no sort of premeditation of the thing, and then it just appears as you're writing. And that's a very singular experience. I don't know, I'm sure it comes from other art forms as well, but in writing, I think having those moments is that's what keeps me going on the days that are really difficult. What are some of the things that you enjoy about writing, or the things that make you want to keep writing?
Yeah, look, I couldn't agree further. That those days where you, particularly down here in winter, when I realize I can't feel my fingers because I've kind of got in what you might call the zone, and you're just enjoying it so much, and the scenes or the prose is coming out in a way that is just, I guess, really pleasurable and really enjoyable to go, I'm just having a ball doing this. And obviously it's not always like that. Obviously there are days and weeks of just struggling to get anything useful out. But I agree. I think that's the best part of it. The writing process itself is the most rewarding part of writing. Like it's obviously nice to have your book come out and meet people who've read your book. That's really great too. But on a I guess intrinsic personal level, it's coming away from the page or the computer and going, oh, that was the best day I've had in ages. But then you don't know how to communicate that to your friends or your partner because it's such a personal experience. But yeah, I agree. I mean, I think if I wasn't having anything published, I'd still feel a big compulsion to try and compose something. And I think that's a really important part of having a love for writing. Because if nothing's being published, but you still want to do it, I think that shows that it's more of a calling than a profession. I think if that makes sense. But yeah, definitely those moments.
Yeah, if you think about the Rain Heron, which parts of it as a writer felt compelling, or what were the parts early on that drove you? What were the things that you found most interesting? Or you're like, oh, I really want to figure this out, or this to me is really interesting, this part of this story. Are there parts that you can remember that kind of were the things that kept you going? I know for me with Sharks in the Time of Saviors, I think one of the things that in the early drafts that I was really interested about was the idea of myth and just stories that people tell themselves about themselves, and that there's like the idea of myths at a cultural level, but there's also the idea of like your personal narrative being a myth at some level, because I think everybody sort of constructs their narrative in a way that is very subjective and often casts them in a favorable light. And so you kind of build up this myth about yourself. And so one of the things that, I found really interesting in the early going with my novel was exploring that idea and starting to think about, if all these different people had the same experience and they take away from it a different idea of themselves and a different myth, what is that? How does that play out over the course of the story? Or what's interesting about the myths that people tell themselves about themselves? Were there things like that for you in this book that were kind of the initial almost obsessive questions or concepts that you were trying to put down on the page?
Yeah, they were. And first, yeah, I love that in Sharks in the Time of Saviors, that element you played with there of intertwining those personal takes on personal myths with the larger myth that was kind of encompassing all of them. I really, really enjoyed that. Just throwing that out there, I thought it was great. But with the Rain Heron, I guess early on, what really compelled me in the writing process of it was first the creation of the myth itself, a bit similar to yourself, but also in this idea of creating an animal that's almost totemic of the beauty and savagery of nature, kind of like a storm, like that it's absolutely amazing to look at and you're drawn into it, but also it's really deadly and it will hurt you. And also I wanted to create this mythical creature that didn't care about people at all, because animals don't care about people. I don't really like those fairy tales where the animals are really concerned with humans, because why would they be? And then beyond that, once I was really happy with and really enjoying that creation process. I found it really compelling to intertwine that with these stories of these human characters I'd created, and to show how they'd interact with this creature. And first of all, whether or not they believe in it, and whether or not they can convince others that it's real, almost in this cat and mouse game between two of the characters, and then set out, on the slopes of this mountain. I just almost felt like in a waking dream for a couple of months while writing that, because I didn't necessarily think, I'm onto something here, this is great. I just thought, I'm really interested in this part of the story. I didn't feel like it was work at all. I wanted to see it through to the end. It's probably one of the most fun I've had writing, I think, because I was so invested in. Other parts got more tricky, but that was a lot of fun.
It's interesting that you mentioned sort of the complete lack of concern or interest, the sort of general apathy that animals have for humans generally. And I think that as a concept, in terms of the relationship or the terms of the relationship between humans and their natural environment, I think that's very true. There's a certain amount of apathy, or at some level, a little bit of antagonism, in the sense that, when you go out if you really go out and experience a natural environment on the terms of that environment, so you're not out there in some sort of really well-structured vehicle, or you're in some sort of really comfortable cabin, but if you're just out in this space with this little technology sort of brokering the relationship between you and the natural world, it very quickly can be an incredibly uncomfortable place, and you can feel very much not only like an intruder, but just that you could at any moment be completely eliminated or rejected by the natural world. And I think that you had mentioned in one of your interviews that you had talked about one of the things in the book that was interesting to you was sort of the relationship between people, or sort of the violence between people, and the violence that also can be perpetrated between humans and the natural world. And also that can come the other direction, right? It's certainly animals in the natural world can do violent things to humans. And I think we all can think of experiences or stories of humans, the bad things humans do to each other, and violence humans cast on each other, and how that can also carry over into the natural world. But what are some ideas you have of the sort of the inverse of that, ways in which the relationship between humans and the natural world has been a positive one in both directions? Are there things that you can think of that are sort of the inverse of that? Or I don't know if that had anything to do with any of the writing you had in the novel, because at some moments, there's certainly moments of sort of beauty and peace and what feels like a somewhat reciprocal relationship. Some of those felt like to me that happened later on in the story, but I don't know if you had other thoughts about the inverse of the violent part of the relationship between humans or the natural world.
Yeah, that's a question, and it's something that I definitely was thinking about a lot, because that is a concept that I guess a lot of people can think of as a bit starry-eyed or unbelievable these days, that we can have this happy hand-in-hand relationship with nature, as if it's almost a bit of an eye roll moment because we're such an advanced civilization now. But the reality of it is that humans existed in perfect symbiosis with nature for thousands and tens and hundreds of thousands of years. In many cultures across the world. And I don't see why that has to be such a silly concept to some people. Where I'm from here in Tasmania, there's, that we know of, 65,000 years of human habitation. And from all the reports and history we have of the Aboriginal people of Tasmania, they lived very comfortably here, were never hungry, were perfectly fine, and never really even had much warfare with each other, because they had a very strict sense of codes and honors and languages that prevented things like that. So I would think about things like that quite a lot, and this idea that we can have a much more harmonious relationship with the natural world. Probably it would come at a few costs, I guess, for the way we live now. But yeah, I definitely was thinking about that, because when I was writing it, and particularly in the coastal section of the book, there's the relationship between the humans there and a certain species of squid there have quite a symbiotic relationship. I won't give away exactly how. But yeah, you're totally right. I think these things can happen, and just as horrible as we can be to the natural world, we just have as much capability of existing with it. And I'm hopeful for things like that. It might be a bit naive, but and I wanted that sense of hope to be in the book a bit. I didn't want it to be all violence and doom, because we still have a great opportunity to turn things around.
Yeah, yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think that I'm always, certainly as a writer, the work that I'm working on now speaks more towards that, you know, towards a sense of optimism. I find it's really interesting that that eye roll, right? Like, where does that come from? That whole idea that, you know, I at one level believe that there's a certain amount of self-fulfilling prophecy in the stories we tell ourselves. And I believe it might have been, I can't remember the name of the author that had a quote to the effect of, you know, we are what we tell ourselves we are, right? Or we are what we pretend to be. So you have to be very careful about what you pretend to be. And I often wonder about the place that fiction might occupy in helping us tell better stories about ourselves, or helping give us an idea of what the future could look like if it's not an apocalyptic future. Because there are so many dystopian stories in the world, and so many like post-apocalyptic, you know, everybody's on the road and society has collapsed and people are in stages of cannibalism and some level of tribal warfare and things like that. Like, there are a million stories like that, and there's so many less that try and imagine how things could go if we got them right. In in crafting this story, there's a little bit of that, you know, in the Rain Heron, we see some of that come on late in the novel, as I mentioned. At least to me, it felt like there was a sense of some level of optimism towards the tail end of it. When you sat down to write it, or as you were getting to the tail end of the writing, since it sounds like it was really organic, did you have different, did it go one direction and you were like, nah, I don't really like the way that feels? Or did it kind of, it feel like it led to the ending that it got to? Or did it feel like you had to spend some time sort of rethinking about it to make it feel, I can see how it could have been even more of a downer of a book, right? It could have been even more bleak and unsatisfying. And as a reader, you could have been like, well, that was very unsatisfying. And they, for me as a reader that wants to believe in like hope for humanity. And it doesn't feel like that, right? It feels much more, at least to me, more optimistic. And so in getting to that ending, did it feel like it took a lot of work to get to that place, or did it feel like it just sort of presented itself?
Yeah, it did. I was playing around with a few different, not necessarily fully formed out endings, but different ways the last part of the story could go. And I really wasn't comfortable with a lot of them. Some felt a bit too pat and too neat. Some felt a bit too, like you say, bleak. And some felt a bit too oblique, where I left it all much too open and it would just be frustrating. So when I arrived at the ending I did, say the last 40 pages, I almost felt lucky. I thought, I think this is the right one. And then when I wrote it out and fleshed it out, I felt quite confident in it. But again, it's that element of experimentation and finding the right tone to hit. And in some ways, I felt like it came to me rather than I got out a mighty pen and figured out how to do it. Yeah, but I absolutely wanted that sense of vague hope to be coming out of the ending of the book, because if anything, I want the book also to be somewhat useful to people rather than just depressing. And it's how I feel. And I thought, if it's how I feel, it probably should be in the book.
Yeah, I think you've mentioned in other interviews before, and I have the same preference in terms of didacticism, or trying to avoid beating the reader over the head with a sort of moral of the story, or trying to impress a certain set of values or lessons on the reader through the course of the story. And, you know, what, if anything, were the parts of this book, what would you hope readers take away from this as they read it? You know, if we talk about some of the different themes at a high level of the relationship between different types of humans, or between humans in the natural world, and this idea of myth, you know, among all the different things at a high level that the book is doing, what are some of the things that you are kind of hopeful that readers might take away from it?
Yeah, great question. I think I'd love it if people were to read the book and come away thinking that the world is just as interesting and surprising as the people in it. Yeah, I think that's how I'd like them to feel. Not necessarily much more strongly than that, other than, yes, it'd be great if we didn't burn down every forest on the planet. But I think a lot of, like you say, I didn't want to be didactic. I mean, there's a lot of nonfiction work that does that really well. And I think it's the role of good reportage in nonfiction. And with fiction and with this book, I would hope people would come away feeling a renewed sense of energy about just how wonderful and interesting the world can be. Not necessarily anything much more than that, but I think little seeds like that can have a great effect later on. But yeah, just the world's an amazing place. People are pretty good too, but the world will be here after we're gone as well. So that's how I was thinking about it, and I hope that's what people are getting out of it too.
Were there any characters or any of the situations that are there? You know, we talked a little bit about Zoe. We haven't talked much about Ren, or I can't remember the name off the top of my head of the medic. There's a medic that occupies sort of in the middle.
Alec.
Yeah, you know, among those characters, did you feel? And again, I know that you weren't operating from a sense of symbolism or metaphor necessarily, but were there any of them that, as you had developed them, they felt symbolic or potentially as if they spoke to certain types of people or certain parts of the world as you have observed around you?
I did kind of shift some of their characterizations a little bit to make them less fit an archetype of things. I toned back on Zoe's cruelty in a sense. I made Ren a bit more elusive and less of a tough old battle axe. In earlier drafts, she was she's the woman, a hermit living on a side of the mountain, roughly in her 50s, trying to escape the world. I had her as a bit rougher, and I found her then just a bit more of a stereotype. So I changed her characterization a little bit to make her, that less hard to grasp, and hopefully a bit more interesting. And sorry, Alex, the character at the end, I realized I got confused. Daniel, the character who's a medic in the middle of the book. I just shifted and played around with him a bit to make him a bit less, I guess, morally dubious, because I had him originally being a bit more of a poor guy caught up in the storm of it all, but I changed him a little to be slightly complicit in some of the less savory actions, because I think that's more true to reality, that people who get caught up in horrible things often do horrible things themselves as a way of staying safe. And I changed them all just a little bit that way to, I guess, to round them out. And I guess that's what you do when you're redrafting and characterizing and working on characters. You want to make them feel a bit more real rather than caricatures, hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm trying to remember now, like this, when we find out a little bit about why Daniel became the soldier that he was in the story, I appreciated that there was a certain amount of, just pure self-interest in the choices that he had made early on and why he became a soldier, and sort of some of the other things that were happening over the course of the part of his journey that we see, which I really appreciated, because a lot of times I think it's easy to take characters like that in particular. If you've got a soldier or somebody that's operating as an agent of some larger force, it's really easy to either make them in totally, I don't know, they can be operating at the level of just a pawn and they're completely ignorant of the larger implications of what they're doing. And they're still like, I'm just caught up in this bigger system. It's not my fault. Or they sort of revel in the boundaries of their agency. And then you end up with some sort of, I don't know, bloodthirsty soldier or things like that. And I appreciated that we find Daniel someplace in the middle of all those. And all of the characters really had a satisfying amount of complexity to them. I think that we're just about, maybe we'll talk for like another minute or two, and then I think we're going to open things up for Q&A. So I'm looking through a couple of the other questions I had. When you, as a writer, when you're making decisions about language, how do you go about that? Do you spend a lot of time consciously crafting sentences and like paying attention to the rhythm and the types of words that you use? Or do you feel like that part is sort of an extension of your natural voice and you don't spend a lot of time trying to, get into the intricacies of the grammar and language itself?
Oh, I'm shocking. I go over and over and over every sentence and paragraph until I'm happy with it. My writing and drafting process is just a mess. Like I'll get maybe a page down and then I'll obsess over that page for a long time until I'm happy with it. The flow of language. I don't really feel like it's an extension of me that much, because with each book I write or each thing I write, I generally change slightly the tone or the style, not in a big way. Everything's really descriptive, I find. But I get really nitty gritty on the line level with flow and rhythm, as you mentioned. I can't help it. Otherwise, I can't sleep. Otherwise, I just lie there going, that page isn't good enough. what's the point of doing something that's not good enough and I can't move on? It's probably not healthy and it's probably not sustainable, but it's the only, I'm a bit obsessive with it. It's the only way I can do it at the moment. What about you? How do you just get a whole draft out, or do you draft as you go, or edit as you go, or?
Yeah, so I think that I do a certain amount of editing as I go. I think for me, I come into books as a reader through language. And so I find oftentimes there are a lot of books that many readers love, and they're, you know, they're bestsellers, or they're the ones that are up for all the awards in a given year, all the literary awards. And then I'll open them up to read them. And if the language to me feels, I don't know, almost, I'm blanking on the word that I want to use. It can have a certain amount of almost like a scientific level of precision. I can see this sometimes in writers that are really like formally trained, that have been through writing programs. A lot of times they've gotten to a point where they really understand the mechanics of language. And so they write with a sense of wanting to make a sentence that is the best constructed sentence possible, but it can sometimes feel lifeless. Or I can come to books where the language is very straightforward and it just doesn't really grip me. And so even though the story might be interesting, I think if the language doesn't feel like it's pulling me into like a different space, if I don't feel like as a reader I'm having an experience with the book that I couldn't have watching a movie or you know, watching a play, if I feel like the experience I'm having as a reader is the same as I could have with other storytelling mediums, then I tend to lose interest in the book. So as a writer, I'm hyper focused on the language evoking an experience for the reader that is very specific to reading and writing. You can't, I want people to, when they read a book, when they read a book or something that I've written, have it be something that they couldn't have that experience with any other form. So I definitely obsess about language. And even up to the point after I send it off and it's getting like published, I'll open it up later and be like, no, like I'll read a page and be like, that's totally wrong. I want to fix that sentence right now. So I don't think it ever goes away. I don't think it's ever a perfect version or one that I'm happy with. I think we're about to open things up for Q&A, but I remember there was one more question I wanted to ask, which is about, I think this is actually probably a gift. It sounds like it's lovely to have experienced, but you work in advertising and you've mentioned in one of your interviews that there's such a very frank discussion of the production that happens as an advertiser. And so if you work on something and you bring it to your editing team, I don't know exactly how advertising works or who you run things by, but somebody, it sounds like, will look at something and be like, that's total garbage, we're not going to use it. And you just have to go on with your day. Yeah.
Yeah,
and,
like
yeah, no, go ahead. I just, to me, it'd be so nice to have people constantly berating my work, such that I would just be like, you know what? You can say whatever you want about my work and it doesn't even touch me, because we're just doing work and then we're moving on.
Yeah, I've developed a very thick skin, not deliberately, but like I went to university and got a degree, and I'm not really good at anything. And I thought, how can I get work as a writer? So I got a job as a copywriter in an advertising agency. I've been doing that for a while since. And you like you said, you just get the most frank feedback. Frank is probably an understatement. So when I was a junior copywriter living in Melbourne, it was very regular to go into my boss's office at night or show the person in charge the bunch of copy I'd done. And they just put a line through it and say, hope you haven't got plans tonight. You're working late, or this is shit. Why did you bring this to me? And there's no regard for your feelings. And I wasn't actually ever that offended by it, because that was just the culture and the environment of it. And that's just how it is. And then when you start showing work to clients and they don't like it either, and they say, why are we paying you? This is stupid. So and then when I started getting books published or work published and working with editors, it just, as far as I'm concerned, they're the nicest people in the world.
Yeah.
They just have really, and when they do want you to change something, they've really thought about it. And they're really professional and they're really intelligent, and I just feel like I've got someone helping me make my work better, which I'm just grateful for, as opposed to like this kind of drunk old white guy just shouting that he wishes things were like in the 80s and keep working till midnight. So yeah, it's great. It has prepared me quite well. It's a bit different reading like reviews or whatever review of your work, because it's work obviously you care a lot more about than a radio ad. But yeah, it has served me well so far.
Yeah, no, that's nice. I think that for me personally, I've certainly found that because I came into writing a bit later in terms of trying to actually publish things and put them out into the world, I don't think I had anything published until I was well into my 30s. I'm 41. I'm about to be 41 in May. And I don't think it was until somewhere in my mid 30s or something that I had tried getting things published and started getting like other people reading my work and coming back to me and giving me, critical feedback on it. And so I think I had already gotten to a stage where I didn't quite take myself so seriously, or my identity wasn't so tied so closely to my writing and being like, I really, really need this writing to be good, or else I don't know how I'm going to feel about myself as a person. And I think that helped me some. Sometimes I have of friends or, just people that meet me at different events that they're just getting started writing and they really want to publish things and they're very young. And I can tell that for them, being a writer that's published and respected is a really critical part of their identity. And I think for me, much like for you, having worked in copy for ads, I think that just being the age I am has been a blessing, because I'm a little bit less, if people don't like my writing, it doesn't hurt me personally as much as it probably would have if I were younger and if I had kind of tied my identity up with being a writer first and foremost. So sometimes people have like really bad things to say about my writing, and I'm like, you're probably right. I'm just like, sounds good. You don't like my writing. Some other people, there's plenty of other books I've read where lots of people love it and I don't like it. And that just means I'm not the right reader at that moment for that book, and I don't really necessarily take it personally, because in a lot of cases, I think sometimes, books, you can read a book in one moment and it doesn't work for you as a reader, but that doesn't mean it's a bad book or that the writing is bad or that the author is bad. It just means that for you, the book and you are not in a place where you necessarily work together well. And that's why it's fun to come back to books later on and read them. I try to go back and read books that when I was at some other stage of my life didn't like, and to see if maybe I appreciate the book at that point in time. I don't know if you have books like that. I don't know if we have any. I don't see anything in the Q&A, so I guess we can just keep talking for a few more minutes. But can you think of any books that are like that for you, where you had tried reading them when you were younger, or people told you to read it at some point in your life and it just didn't work, and then you came back to it later and you're like, oh, now this book is lovely? Or the other way around, something you loved when you were younger and then you read it later on and you're like, I don't know why I like this book so much.
Yeah, I mean, when I was a teenager, I just couldn't read Jane Austen. I just thought, this is silly. I don't like it. I don't care about any of these rich women in Victorian England. Like, what has this got to do with me? And being from a colonial, ex-colonial place like Tasmania, I'm kind of anti-English poshness just in my bones. So I'm a descendant of convicts. So I kind of have drilled into me that that's ridiculous and we shouldn't like that. And so then I tried reading it again 15 years later. I'm like, oh, actually, this is very subtle and very clever. And the way these characters relate to each other, yes, it's very arch, but there's a lot of skill and a lot of pleasure to be got out of it. So it's good. It's good to be wrong about those things, because you can get pleasure out of things like this. I can't think of any books. I like when I was like 18, 19, I was one of those horrible, pretentious English students. And my friend, I worked in a bookshop, and my friend gave me all the Raymond Carver stories to read. And I was like, oh, I'm the first person to ever read Raymond Carver. And how great is he? How good is minimalism? What a genius. And I still obviously think he's really good. He did amazing stuff. But I read him now and I go, oh, yeah, this is pretty good. But it's a very narrow form of telling a story. I still think it's still good, but I'm no longer blown away because I read it and get it. And it's no longer has this new effect on me. I guess they're probably good examples. But it's interesting what you said about how when people don't like your work, because I'm like you, I don't take it personally at all, because the only time I ever, I guess, dwell on it is if people have a bit of a response to you and they read intentions, an author's intentions into a book, or read like an author's personality into it. And I just think that's really weird. Like, I think some people assume authors or writers are just so sure of what they're doing and know exactly what they're doing when they're writing a book. They release it and kind of smugly cross their arms as if they've solved the world's problems. And I almost want to say, I don't know what I'm doing. Like, most people don't. We're just trying our best and hoping that someone likes it. And it's okay if you don't like it. But yeah, it's the kind of the personal reading into things, I think. Like when people say, "Oh, you must be like this because of this," and I go, "No, but yeah, sure, whatever." Yeah, it's quite funny.
Yeah,
Part
that
of the
is
term.
strange. Yeah, I've had that same experience. I have that I have had, and I'm sure I will continue to have that same experience. It's very interesting what people are willing to assume or to impose on an author's work or an artist's work more generally, when it could be totally wrong. And there's so much, and that's, I think, one of the things that makes me less likely to take people's reactions personally, is because I think that you can often find that a person's reaction to your work has as much to do with them as anything else, right? And so, as a reader, you come to the page with your own preferences and biases and your worldview, and you, in a lot of cases, depending on the book's topic or what it might be speaking about, you'll come to it with an even harsher sense of imposing your own interpretation of what that sort of a story should be like, or what if somebody is to speak about, say, for instance, the relationship between humans and the environment, well, it has to speak about it this way, or else it's engaging in this sort of problematic behavior. And while there are certainly situations where that some version of that reading is important and can be true, there's also sometimes a strange self-assurance on the part of a reader that they have the perfect understanding of both you as an author and the book's intentions, and they're like, well, I read it and clearly this is what you were doing, and that says this about you. It's such a strange experience to have as a writer. I think I have a very similar experience to you, where I'm just like, well, I was trying to do a certain thing, and clearly it didn't work for you, or you have a very different reading of it, and that's very interesting. And I think we can both have our versions of the book be what it is.
Yeah, I had a men's rights activist get really mad at me in a bookshop once, and that was almost fun. In a weird way, he starts, "I've read your books. You hate men. You love women. You think," yeah. And he was just kind of ranting, and I was just like, I hope someone's filming this, because it's incredible. Like you say, it said a lot more about him than me and my books. But it's really, kind of just really funny. But yeah.
So it looks like we have a question here. Somebody just put a question in. The name is M West, and they wrote, "Have the cultures of indigenous peoples influenced your writing? And if so, how? P.S. Hello from Western Massachusetts." So yes, hello, Western Massachusetts. Nice to have you on. But yeah, the cultures of indigenous people, has it influenced your writing? And if so, how?
Yeah. Hello, M from Western Massachusetts. Hello from Hobart. Yeah, absolutely, in a really strong way, and something that I'm quite influenced by here in Australia and Tasmania, but also in a way I'm very mindful of. It's probably, I don't know how much you in America know about the history of Australia's Indigenous people, but almost over the entire continent, extremely horrific things happened through colonization and through the British regime, of which I am a descendant. So where I'm from, Tasmania, Lutruwita in the local language, it's really, really important that I think those things are acknowledged and those things are present in writing about the place. However, I'm really conscious of not telling Indigenous stories for them, because not only is that not helpful anyway, it's all just a dick move. Like, I'm not going to do that. But yeah, the Indigenous cultures, I think we have so much to learn from them, not just in Australia, but also in other, like I was saying earlier, about this way of working within the land and working alongside the landscape as opposed to purely exploiting it. Yeah, absolutely. I think there's still many, many things that we can learn from them, and I try to look to learn from, both in fiction and just in values, to be honest. Yeah, I mean, people existed for so long, so well before what we think of as modern history, and obviously they knew what they were doing. So yeah, I just find that stuff fascinating, and I think it's worth looking into.
Yeah. I think that was our only question. I don't know if Alex, if you want to, yeah, I think I see Alex now.
Hello again. This has been a great conversation. I just love how much ground you have covered. And while listening, I did have a couple of questions of my own, so I would love to get a chance to ask them before we close out, if that's okay. First of all, I wanted to say, for anyone who hasn't read Kawai's book, who's here through Robbie but doesn't know Kawai's book, it is really incredible. It combines a boy with unexpected powers with this sort of intense, detailed, intimate family history of one family, parents through children, starting in Hawaii and moving to the continental US. And it's an incredibly loving and detailed book that is deeply emotional. And if you have not picked it up, you absolutely should. So I think these are great books to read alongside each other because they are not superficially the same, but there's a depth of mythology and emotion that I think if it carries you through one of these books, it will carry you through the other. So highly recommended that you go and do that. As far as questions, I did want to ask you, Robbie, this is like such a specific kind of storytelling that you're doing here. And I think it's easy to say, like, what are the novelists that have most influenced you? But I think maybe more pertinent here is what storytelling in general became formative in how you've grown as a storyteller, not necessarily novels, but overall.
Yeah, great question. Thank you, Alex. Like I mentioned earlier, Raymond Carver and things like that. I really had to unlearn minimalism for about 4 or 5 years because I just, like so many like young, boring white guys, I just got really into the uni. And then went through that kind of David Foster Wallace period as well, which just is best left not spoken about. And then one thing that really kind of jump-started me into writing a bit differently, and I guess writing a bit more descriptively and hopefully uniquely and using myth and things like that. There's a UK novelist called Jeanette Winterson.
Yeah.
And I really love her books and the way she comes at interesting human stories almost from a sideways angle. Mm-hmm. And she uses really interesting prose. She's got a novel called The Passion, which is set during the Napoleonic Wars. I don't know if anyone's read it, but it feels like a myth. It feels like almost a fairy tale, but it's kind of the story of these characters in Europe during Napoleon's wars. And I just thought it was such an interesting way to do it. So that's always rattled around in my head. And I guess another thing is contemporary nature writing and in nonfiction. Mm-hmm. People like Robert Macfarlane or Helen MacDonald, I just think the way they kind of describe the natural world and describe interactions between things, I like that use of almost that over-the-top use of language sometimes. And back onto what Kawai was saying earlier about you can read a book that's so clean and precise that you can be, I agree that you can really be in admiration of the skill, but also be left feeling a little cold. And I like the way these nature writers don't. They kind of just go all out and I thought I wish I wanted to write fiction like that too. So sorry, it's probably a rambling answer to a few of the influences on how my fiction is.
No, that's great. And I think that's really interesting too, because I think the interplay that you're looking at between nature and humankind and how they are, both part of the same thing and how they reflect on one another is so crucial to that specific genre of nonfiction, which I kind of think of as like nature memoir, which actually happens to be a sort of subgenre of books that I find absolutely addicting, because it's such an intimate and emotional call to understanding like an individual human's part in nature, like the fact that we're part of that, and also the way in which we write nature's story and nature writes our stories. And I think Helen MacDonald is just like an awesome example of how like a human story is built into the world, and we understand the world, through the human story. So that's really neat. And I actually wondered if there were any other nonfiction books. You mentioned specifically that you wish to avoid didacticism, but there is sort of direct conveyance of information in some really good nonfiction right now. Were there any titles that you would recommend on that front?
Yeah, there's actually an older book that I read a year or two ago that just completely hit me for six. Sorry, that's a cricket term. Hit me for a home run. It's called The Peregrine by J.A. Baker. Yeah, I don't know if anyone knows this book. Like, it's just, he was just this kind of semi-retired postal worker / public servant who lived in Essex in England and just rode his bicycle around the wet Essex moors, looking at peregrine falcons and describing one. particularly one. And it's all it is. That's their whole book. And it reads like poetry. And at the time of his writing, it was post-World War II, and the population of peregrine falcons was in massive decline because they'd been hunted because they were killing passenger pigeons, like male pigeons during the war. So Britain tried to kill them all. And then all the pesticides were weakening the eggshells of peregrine falcons. So the whole time he was writing it, he was just assuming that the species was going extinct. This kind of really beautiful creature was soon to not going to exist anymore. So it's just this simple set of diary entries that's completely infused with love and poetry. And it's called The Peregrine. And I just thought, he's not set out to try and attach a narrative or a plot structure to this. He's just written what he feels really powerful about, and it's worked out as something amazing. And I really admire books like that, where they don't go, here's X plot structure, X beats, this is going to happen, this is going to be the twist, this is next going to happen. You just fill the book with love. And that's something that I think about all the time. So I think The Peregrine is one that I always recommend. And people start rolling their eyes at me now, but yeah.
I think fill the book with love is a pretty good ending point. On The Peregrine, that book was recently reissued. So if anyone hasn't read it and would like to, you should be able to get hold of a copy pretty easily. As far as this book, I'm so excited that the Rain Heron is in the world. I'm so excited for you to share all of your ideas as you've discussed with a broad audience. And I'm so happy that we were able to have this wonderful conversation with you, Robbie and Kawai, tonight. Thank you to everyone who has been here this evening. Did either of you have anything that you wanted to say before concluding?
Only, I guess, Margaret was here at the start. I'm not sure if they're still here, but I love public libraries. And as a kid in Hawaii for a very large portion of my youth, that was what I had for books. You know, all I had was a public library. And so I love public libraries deeply. We take our daughters to our local public library every weekend that we've been able to with the pandemic. And I went home after having been away for years and years and years, and the librarian at my little public library in my hometown remembered me. She was like, I remember you. You came here like years ago all the time. So I just wanted to give a shout out to public libraries and librarians. And thank you very much for all you do. That's it for me.
Yeah, I reiterate that about libraries. And also I just want to thank everyone for coming along, and thank you, Alex, and big thanks to you, Kawai, by Kawai's book. And it was so nice to come to Boston from the bottom of the world. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye.